Thanks very much for staying with me. Time now for Eye on Africa. With me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the UN questioned DR Congo's efforts to head off a massacre in which hundreds were killed in brutal intercommunal violence. Human rights investigators say that the killings around Yumbi territory could amount to crimes against humanity. Also, loved ones of the 157 victims of Sunday's fatal plane crash in Ethiopia finally get to visit the impact site. Meanwhile, Boeing 737 MAX 8 jets around the world are grounded. And Triggerfish races ahead in graphic and design on the continent. The South African studio is breaking new ground in locally created animation with African-centered stories for their audiences. But first, UN investigators have verified that at least 535 men, women and children were killed in a brutal massacre in DR Congo between December 16th and 18th last year. They say that the violence could amount to crimes against humanity. The organization's Human Rights Office sent in a team to only 3 locations in Yumbi territory where attacks had been reported. They couldn't make it to a 4th and fear that the death toll could be much higher. A report has detailed horrific accounts of rape, murder, mutilation of adults and children from the Banunu community by Batende villagers. Now, the violence was triggered by a dispute over the burial of a Banunu chief and their fears that more attacks could still happen. Earlier, I spoke to the UN's human rights spokesperson, Ravina Shamdasani, who told me that the Congolese authorities could have done more ahead of the killings.
There were clear signs before the killings took place. There were clear signs of rising tensions between the communities relating to the burial of this customary chief. However, the authorities failed to take note of the very high likelihood that violence would erupt. We understand that there were actually police and security agents who were present in the territories the day before the killings took place, but they had left before the killings actually started.
Can you give us a quick overview of just some of the findings of your investigators?
We have been able to verify that 535 people were killed. Now, the rapidity and the brutality of this violence indicates that this was planned and it was a systematic attack against these 4 villages. These people, the members of the Batende community, were armed with bows and arrows, with machetes and with hunting rifles. And they attacked the villages with such speed, burning down houses, raping villagers, throwing bodies into the Congo River, that we fear that the death toll may actually be much higher because some of the bodies may have been burnt beyond recovery. Others may have been dumped into the river.
And you fear that there may still be a risk of violence? Is that the case?
Indeed, most of the community has actually fled. Some 16,000 have fled across the border to the Republic of Congo. Another 3,000 have fled to different parts of the country. We do fear that if there is a failure to bring to justice the perpetrators of this violence, it will turn into a situation where an entire community will be tarred with the same brush, where an entire community will be held responsible for the violence against another community. And this will then lead to reprisal attacks and a cycle of violence which may become very difficult to contain.
In other news, US civil aviation and Boeing investigators arrived in Ethiopia on Tuesday to help with the search for answers in the debris of Sunday's fatal plane crash. 157 people were killed after flight ET-302 went down shortly after taking off from Addis Ababa for Nairobi. Family and friends of victims also visited the crash site in Bishoftu for the first time. The dead came from over 30 different countries, and Ethiopia has warned that it could take weeks for bodies to be identified and remains returned home.
A mother grieves for her daughter at the spot where she lost her life in such tragic circumstances.
What I'm now demanding is that I get the body of my child. Whatever has happened, I now need to lay her to rest. I came here to see where my daughter lost her life and to make peace.
Dozens of relatives have flocked to the crash site just south of the capital. It was here on Sunday that the Ethiopian Airlines flight with 157 people aboard plummeted to the ground. As the families and friends of the victims try desperately to come to terms with their deaths, they want to know why the plane carrying their loved ones took them to their graves so shortly after takeoff.
We came here to pay our respects to our friend, even if we cannot see his body. We came to cry at the place where he lost his life and bid him farewell. Everyone knew him as positive, humble, and a good person.
But it could take weeks, if not months, for the remains to be sent to their families. Complicating matters even more, the passengers came from more than 30 countries, and Ethiopia has limited forensic facilities. That could draw out the process of identifying the victims. And as the grieving goes on, problems are piling up for Boeing. The company has sent a technical team to the crash site to help with the investigation. Meanwhile, the UK, France and Germany have added their names to the growing list of countries to ban 737 MAX 8s from operating in their airspace.
Well, thousands of protesters returned to the streets of Algeria on Tuesday to accuse their president of trying to sleight of hand his way to an extension of his time in power. On Monday, President Abdelaziz Bouteflika agreed to give in to demonstrators' demands that he not run for a fifth term in elections that had been due in April. But the leader, at the same time, also postponed that vote, and no new date has yet been set.
Preparing new slogans for a fresh round of protests. A day after Abdelaziz Bouteflika announced he wouldn't run for a fifth consecutive term, euphoria was slowly giving way to skepticism in the Algerian capital.
I'm here to say enough is enough. It's our turn to take over Algeria. We want to see a new generation. We're tired of the old guard.
We have great hopes for our country. We want it to evolve and to have a president who's really here.
Among the protesters, many young Algerians who weren't convinced by the president's latest announcement. Some were holding up copies of the constitution to denounce the decision to postpone the election.
I'm here to ask the regime to leave once and for all. Algerians want to build a second republic without them.
Many protesters are worried that even with Bouteflika gone, the country's political elite will continue to pull the strings. They're calling for immediate change, and on social media, some have already begun to plan a fourth Friday of demonstrations.
Well, French President Emmanuel Macron met with his Djiboutian counterpart and the Prime Minister of Ethiopia on Tuesday at the start of a visit to the continent. Macron first met with Djibouti's leader, Omar Guelleh, before continuing on to Ethiopia, where he and Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed visited the historic churches of Lalibela, which France has promised to help restore. Now, Macron's due in Kenya on Wednesday for a UN environmental summit, and whilst on his trip has said that Rwanda has invited him to attend the 25th anniversary of the country's genocide later this year. And finally, to Triggerfish, which has raced ahead in the design and graphics industry on the continent. It is a South African studio which is breaking new ground in locally created animation by making African-centered stories for their audiences. And they're clearly doing a good job to impress the right crowd, as last year one of its films was nominated for Best Animated Short Film at the Oscars. Nicolas Chemin tells us more.
The film Adventures of Zambezia was produced in 2012 by Triggerfish Animation Studios, which is based in Cape Town. It made over $34 million at the box office and cemented the company as a trailblazer in African animation movies.
A lot of the content we do get that does get produced in this medium is very Eurocentric and quite Western, and I think there's definitely a big value in diversifying that content in this industry.
Last year, its movie Revolting Rhymes was nominated for Best Animated Short Film at the Oscars. The company is also in the process of establishing its own academy. The aim is to teach and sponsor young people who would not have had the means to follow a career path in animation.
I think animation is the kind of grandest type of storytelling. So you can do anything. It's whatever you can imagine, you can create, and you can use metaphor and talking animals, and it's just it's a great way to communicate, because you can bring across stories that can't be told in any other way.
Triggerfish recently moved into the gaming industry. It also wants to become a player in that other budding South African market.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks very much for joining us, and do so again if you can. Take care.